Thank you also for my behalf for inviting me here. Although my office is just about 70 kilometers north from here, I don't get to come to Tallinn often enough. It's always nice to be here. I will start by making a couple of points on the topic of challenges and global changes, which I would rather qualify and say that I say them in my personal capacity, meaning that they are not necessarily the opinions of Amnesty International. What I'll try to do is to, in a sense, deconstruct our human rights talk a bit for the purpose of getting a good conversation. Then I will briefly explain how Amnesty is actually changing its own work to face the challenges posed by the changing global power balance. Okay, so let me start by saying that I do not think that human rights, in a broad sense, are given absolute truths and above politics. They are, for better or worse, negotiated compromises and deeply political. And they always need political decisions to be implemented, choices between one or two goods that needs to be funded. I will dwell a bit of this point a bit later on. A second point is that there are no natural, good, human rights respecting states and no self-evident evil states. All of them move on a scale. And if we just look at the latest Amnesty International report, we record human rights violations in over 150 countries in the world. And if one country necessarily isn't there, doesn't mean that human rights violations don't take place. It just means that we have not reported them. If we acknowledge this, that no states are perfect and that human rights are based on political agreements, but at the same time we want human rights, or sort of a human rights perspective, a human rights lens, to be both universal and better. This can, of course, only be reached through further political negotiations and listening to all voices, including what we call the BRICS states, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the emerging new powers. These and all other states, be they discontents or skeptics or outright oppositional, have to be part in the conversation of defining what we mean by human rights. So in a sense, I would welcome the new powers challenge as a test for human rights. They might actually become better. They might actually become more universal. On the positive side, it also means that complacent Western states have to become open to criticism and become more transparent in admitting their own failings and also in losing some of their hubris in thinking that they have all the solutions and that all the problems are elsewhere. Human rights are about challenging power everywhere. But they become something entirely different when power itself starts using human rights, usually selectively and hypocritically, as the excuse of squashing other lesser powers. In a recent, very interesting book titled The Last Utopia, the professor of history at Columbia University in New York, Samuel Moyn, argues that the sort of apolitical universal good perception of human rights is very, very recent, and that it only came to be in the 70s. To cut his long argument short, I mean, it's a book of about 250 pages, what he says was that at this time, there was a mixture of simultaneous events that made human rights a leading language for change in the world. One of them was a new sort of moral turn in the foreign policy of the United States, post-Vietnam, post-Watergate, under Jimmy Carter. A second one was the third basket of the Conference of Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the so-called Helsinki process, which was used effectively by Eastern European dissidents and their allies in the Western European peace movement. Thirdly, very strong reactions against the torture and killings perpetrated by Latin American military regimes, and Nobel Peace Prizes given to Andrei Sakharov in 1975 and to Amnesty International in 1977. Because of all these simultaneous things happening around the world, suddenly human rights became pop. They became sort of the cool thing. Their preceding long history, even if we just go as back as 1948 and the adoption of the Universal Declaration, or if we want to go even further back to the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the talks of rights of man, is, according to Moyne, actually an invention that came and was written only after this new birth of the human rights in the late 70s. The way the story is told, as a sort of progression from an idea to becoming something better and more developed all the time. Moyne says that we have actually invented this history only after human rights became the leading language for change in the 1970s. The background to human rights rising to this fore was, according to Moyne, that people, especially in Europe and the United States, had lost faith in the big political and economic narratives of change. The 60s revolution didn't change the system. Socialism, which for many was a political utopia, was dying. The church no longer had the moral lead. And the third world's alternatives were already seen as not working. And instead of these failed maximalist positions, political, spiritual, or economic utopias, human rights were seen as the last minimalist utopia. We cannot change the world, but we can stand for the moral power of human rights. Now, of course, the human rights as expressed here were very narrow, and basically we were talking about the right to free speech, the right to assembly, rule of law, prohibition against torture, very basic civil and political rights, which could be argued and maybe could be seen as being above politics. However, very soon after human rights got to this powerful moral position, they were increasingly asked to solve all problems in the world. And this meant that they moved from minimalist to maximalist in a very short time. But they still maintained their sort of halo of moral authority above politics, even if every single attempt to put economic or social rights into practice, of course, involves deeply political choices. I think it was very interesting, the survey we had here today, where the Estonian people clearly see economic issues and the sort of inequality in economic issues as one of the most important human rights issues. Of course, economic inequality, if you want to deal with that, that means social policies, financial policies that the state can do. And those are deeply political positions. If we look at human rights and their influence on the world, of course, trade policies or financial and economic global institutions have just as much power, even more power to change the world. And if we look at what is happening in, for instance, Greece today, where economic and social rights are being sort of withdrawn on a practical level all the time, these are political decisions. So if you want to actually talk about human rights in a broad sense, you cannot leave politics. And I think that putting human rights on a pedestal and seeing them as absolute truths written in stone, rather than understanding their complexity, is dangerous. Human rights evolve every day. And accordingly, I think we should move from seeing human rights as absolute universal truths to being the best possible result of diplomatic negotiations, to seeing them as political and taking up that political challenge and trying to sell those ideas in a political debate. A reflection of the politics of human rights is exemplified in a small but very interesting study made by the European Council of Foreign Relations in 2008. I don't know if Anthony Dworkin is still in the room, but this is, of course, the institution he represented. And he actually told me during a break that he was one of the people who edited this study. It shows that where the European Union in the early 90s in the United Nations would get the support of over 70% of the countries for their human rights initiatives, in the 2000s, this figure has sunk to around 50%. At the same time, Russia and China are getting higher figures for their positions. The EU cannot any longer count on automatic support from African, Asian, and Latin American democracies for their policies. If human rights are a revolution from below, which I hope they are, this could be seen as not necessarily human rights losing out, but rather be seen as Western power politics and Western dictates as losing out. And before you think that I've completely lost my mind, I want to assure you that I'm not so naive as to think that the governments of, for instance, Russia and China or other emerging powers necessarily or even at all advance human rights. Just as the EU and the United States, they are playing their own power politics. But we know, of course, that in India, in Brazil, and in South Africa, there are vibrant civil societies who, using human rights language, are forcefully putting pressure on their own governments, both on domestic, socio-economic issues and on civil and political issues, and also putting pressure on their governments to be active in the international arena. We also know the same for Russia. And we know, of course, that the government there is doing its best to stifle those asking for change. In China, organization is probably the most difficult, but even there, local initiatives are taking place that challenge the powers from a rights perspective. I know Anya will be speaking more about this. All these initiatives need to be supported. And in line with this, Amnesty International has embarked on a very large change process, whereby many functions that currently operate out of London, our headquarters, will be moved to different parts of the world. We have, in the last year, opened new offices in Brazil and in India, and they are increasingly getting involved with the local society as one more local voice to put pressure on the Indian and the Brazilian governments. We have already for many years had offices in Moscow, in Hong Kong, and Johannesburg. But also these will be strengthened in the coming years. And other offices will be enlarged in Nairobi and in Dakar, in Eastern and Western Africa, in Mexico City, and in Bangkok. This change means that local activists will be able to engage in our work, and we will learn from them, and they will influence the way Amnesty sees the world. By being present locally in a larger way, we will also be in a better position to mobilize pressure on those governments who take part in the international dialogue, forming the political scene where human rights are daily created again and again and again. In the exact same way that we today lobby in Brussels, in Washington, in London, in Berlin, in Paris, in Helsinki, and in Tallinn. Thank you.